is, but actually it means I've actually already recorded this entire video once and completely screwed it up. I'm new at this. This is only my second video ever, and when I recorded the video last night, as you'll see, we'll be looking at some web pages, and then I went over to watch a video clip, and then went back to comment on some things that we saw on some other web pages, and I forgot to switch the live stream back from the video player. So for the whole final third of the video, I was talking and referencing things that you couldn't see on the screen because it just showed a freeze frame from where I paused the video at the end of the clip. So starting all over again, my name is Adam DeAngeli, and I'm a professional political hack. And today we're going to be talking about the politics of vaping and what's been going on in Washington and in Michigan with vaping bans, and just how it is that they seem to be able to ban the sale of vaping products without any legislature ever actually passing a law. So we're going to look at, I think, first what's been going on at the federal level, where it sounds like for the time being, the plan to ban vaping products through federal regulations has been put on hold. And then we'll take a look at what's going on in Michigan, where it actually went forward but has now been stayed by a court. So let's get right to it. We're going to start with what happened in Washington. So here was the news story just a few weeks ago. Fed ban on flavored vape products expected soon. Menthol and vape stores may be spared. And, I think this channel is going to actually be talking mostly about how the media misleads the public on so many things. So just to nitpick a little bit here, these mainstream media sources apparently don't realize that when they create a news story, it creates the link for the story, and the working title often ends up kind of left behind in the address. So it says here, expected soon is the ban on vaping products, but in the address at the top, you can see in the web address for the story, it says Fed ban flavored vapes imminent. So they changed the word imminent to expected soon. I guess they were hedging their bets, and perhaps smartly so, because as of just a few days ago, this plan has been put on ice. But just to see what this news story says, it says federal regulators are expected to announce a ban on electronic cigarette flavors other than tobacco and menthol within days, although it's unclear if mint flavors will be allowed or reformulated as menthol. And I'm not going to read the whole story. That's the gist of it. And when they say federal regulators are expected to announce a ban, that doesn't mean that they're expected that they're going to ban these products overnight. What that means is that separate from the entire legislative process where a bill becomes a law and it goes through the two chambers of Congress and gets signed by the president, that would become a federal law. It might be part of the U.S. code. There's a totally separate set of laws on the books, although they're not called laws, but they're enforceable just the same, and that's the Code of Federal Regulations, and that's what regulations are passed by various departments. And typically, certainly in Michigan, and probably also at the federal level, a federal regulation typically has to have some legislative basis to it, but the problem is that lawmakers often they'll pass laws that just enable these agencies to do what they wish with respect to a regulation. So, for example, in Michigan here, just to pull up a random law, something relating to the Tourism Policy Act, and it says here that this Michigan Travel Commission can promulgate rules for the implementation of this act, and that basically gives this commission the authority to enact a regulation where typically there's a lengthy process. So at the federal level, it starts with what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking. So going back to the story, although it says there's a federal ban imminent or expected soon, it's not typically that simple. There's actually a process. They have a announcement. It's called the notice of proposed rulemaking. Then there actually can be hearings. There's draft rules, there's all these additional processes and procedures. So it wasn't necessarily like they were going to implement this overnight, but they were certainly going to start moving forward with it until just a few days ago. And here's the more recent story. Trump backing off banning vaping flavors popular with teens. Now, we'll get into that in just a moment because that's a quite interesting headline. It sounds almost like it's editorializing. What makes flavors popular with teens, and is the thing they're banning not just popular with teens, but also with adults? But getting back to what we're looking at here with what's going on with the administration's decision to move forward on rulemaking. And by the way, typically any executive action from a federal agency is expected not to be taken without some kind of approval from the president, although I think we've seen the Trump administration has a number of rogue elements within his administration, but it sounds clear here from this story that in this case, this is something that was going to be moving forward with the president's support and consent. So as the story goes here, when President Donald Trump boarded Air Force One to fly to a Kentucky campaign rally 2 weeks ago, a plan was in place for him to give final approval to ban most flavored e-cigarettes. And again, that's some kind of informal approval. That's not the federal rulemaking process. That still has to go through a whole rulemaking process that can take quite a long time. But he was ready to commit to it, at least. So, by the time Trump landed back at Joint Base Andrews outside Washington a few hours later, the plan was off and its future is unclear. For nearly 2 months, momentum had been building inside the White House to try to halt a youth vaping epidemic that experts feared was hurting as many as 5 million teenagers. We'll be looking at this in more depth in a moment, but the question that is going to be pivotal here is, yes, there may be a youth vaping epidemic, but there has always, at least for as long as I've been alive, a youth smoking epidemic. So to what degree does vaping displace smoking? That's a very important question. But getting back to the story here, here's where we find out where the idea to ban flavored vaping products came from. Both First Lady Melania Trump and the president's daughter Ivanka Trump, who is also his senior advisor, pushed for the ban, which was also being championed internally by White House counselor Kellyanne Conway, who has taken the lead on some public health issues. But as Trump sat surrounded by political advisors on the flights to and from Lexington, he grew reluctant to sign the ban, convinced it would alienate voters who would financially or otherwise be affected by a vaping ban, according to 2 White House and campaign officials not authorized to speak publicly about private conversations. Trump, you still have a leaker problem, buddy. What's going on here? But let's get back to the point here. Melania Trump, Ivanka Trump, and Kellyanne Conway were apparently the 3, at least quoted in this story, that were the ones that were pushing the president to support a ban on vaping products through this rulemaking process. Now, don't get me wrong, they're incredibly smart, capable people, but Melania Trump and Ivanka Trump are not professional, seasoned political operatives. Kellyanne Conway is. However, Kellyanne Conway's background is in polling, and this gives you a clue as to why she might have said to the president this would be a smart idea, because polling shows that banning vaping flavors is popular. And that'd be especially true if you led the question by saying, can we ban flavored vaping products, which we know to be popular among teenagers because teenagers are vaping and blah, blah, blah. But here's the thing. Polling doesn't tell the whole story here, because it's not just a question of how high public support is for banning vaping products. It's a question of how much energy is on either side. Let me explain what I mean. Let's say you do a poll, and we know from experience that one of the demographics that the president's team is concerned about, and they'd especially be concerned about with his election coming up in less than a year from now, is that he performed poorly in the previous election among suburban middle-class women. So polling probably showed that suburban middle-class women who often have young children at home, or they've had children, would be highly supportive of the ban. Let's say they support the issue 4-1. So from a pollster's perspective, this sounds like a really smart thing to do. 4-1 support this. You'll get some people that are angry about it, and you'll have most people that will be happy about it. But the problem is, are these suburban women going to be influenced in how they vote based upon the fact that the president pushes for a vaping ban? Or are they going to be thinking about 100 other issues when they go to the polls? On the other hand, if you're someone who is vaping, potentially you're addicted to nicotine, perhaps you were before, perhaps you were a smoker, and now the government's going to come in and say the products that you like to use on a daily basis are now illegal to be purchased. That could be, for many of them, a single issue. And think about this. Who is going to be supportive of vaping? Who vapes? Is that a Democrat? Is that Democrats, Republicans, independents, swing voters, what have you? I'd bet it's probably just about everybody. It might not be equal across the board, but the point being, the president's going to have a tough election coming up. Everybody, I think, would probably agree to that. You can't afford to have Trump supporters being furious about a vaping ban, or swing voters being furious about a vaping ban. and deciding on that one issue alone that they're not going to support you anymore. So although a poll might show that banning vaping products is popular, that doesn't mean it's the smart political outcome. So the president seems to have seen some of that from his other advisors. Apparently they surrounded him on a flight and convinced him that, no, this is not something that you want to do. And here's maybe where he might have gotten that impression. This is a rally at the Capitol. Apparently just a couple of weeks ago. You see there's thousands of people in these photos holding up signs. We vape, we vote. You got a speaker in that photo there. There's him from another angle. And here's someone saying the exact same thing. What I saw inside the crowd during the vape rally: white, black, Christian, atheist, Muslim, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. That's where you've got an issue where you have voters across the board who potentially will be motivated on one issue alone. And that's something that a politician in a tough campaign can't afford to alienate. So good job to the people that did this. Now, I should say as a caveat, I don't necessarily recommend rallying at the Capitol as the most effective way to lobby for legislation. Politicians don't always actually see them there. Maybe some of these folks knew how to get to the president so that they could get this issue in front of him, possibly. Typically, a better way is to write your representatives, write your senators, even executives like governors and the president. They do have staff that do look at these things. Maybe they knew some people connected to the president. I don't know. But apparently the message got through. But that being said, you have to keep in mind, it still is typically a long-term process to have something put into policy, whether it's through the legislative process or even also through the rulemaking process. However, it's been a very different story here in sunny Michigan, where Governor Gretchen Whitmer issued an emergency rule that effectively outlawed most vaping products in Michigan for a period of 6 months, which she could extend to 1 year. So let's look at how she went about doing that. And let's see, it starts right here. There is this announcement: Governor Whitmer takes bold action to protect Michigan kids from harmful effects of vaping. Notice that the media was using the same angle that the governor is using here. We're going to make this all about the kids. We don't want to talk about the liberties we're taking away from adults that vape. We're going to say this is all about marketing to kids, and that's exactly what she says here. They quote her chief medical executive, Dr. Joni Caldoon, making a finding that youth vaping constitutes a public health emergency. We'll get into the law about that in a moment, but here's the governor's quote. As governor, my number one priority is keeping our kids safe. And right now, companies selling vaping products are using candy flavors to hook children on nicotine and misleading claims to promote the belief that these products are safe. That ends today. Our kids deserve leaders who are going to fight to protect them. These bold steps will finally put an end to these irresponsible and deceptive practices and protect Michiganders' public health. Notice she doesn't actually cite anything that says that companies are intentionally using these flavors to reach kids. That's just asserted as something, obviously the fact that there are, and by the way, I can't recall any advertisements for vaping products that highlight flavors like, I think we'll see her quoting as an example, bubblegum or something like that. And then that's an important distinction too, because, they have those kind of goofy flavors for other adult products too. Here's a flavored vodka. It's clearly intended to resemble Fruit Loops cereal, which is a children's cereal, and so they're apparently marketing this. But are they marketing this to children, or are they marketing this to young adults who might still have a sweet tooth, or maybe any adult that would like a flavor like that? I don't know if this is still on the market or not, but to say that they're using cereal flavors to get children hooked on alcohol is a little misleading. The alcohol is the product here. But that's what she said in her news release, and here's what she says in her. I'm going to put my headphone in here so I can listen along. But here's what she said to reporters when she was announcing this.
The flavored is created and appealing to children. Bubblegum flavor, Fruit Loop flavor, Mott's apple juice flavor. These are.
By the way, I doubt that there is a Mott's apple juice flavor. I don't think the Mott's apple juice company is licensing their trademark to the vaping companies. I think it's probably a little bit something more like this, where it's suggestive, but it's not actually, it's not a Mott's apple juice flavor. And, you know, why would it be a Mott's apple juice flavor? That's apple flavor. That's what that is. So that's a little misleading there. But so is everything that she's saying right here, because she's implying, and I think even saying directly, that they're intentionally marketing these vaping products towards children, and that requires some evidence.
Things that are targeted toward children, toward getting them addicted, to creating consumers for them so they can make money at the risk of children's health. These are kids whose brains aren't even finished forming, who are growing addicted to nicotine. They are not getting off of traditional cigarettes. They are starting a nicotine habit.
Now, that's perhaps sort of true, because historically, teenagers get hooked on cigarettes and then go on to smoke cigarettes as adults. And there may be, I'm sure there are, actually we will see, there are certainly adults who are switching from cigarettes to vaping. But just because there are now, you know, teenagers who are maybe having not smoked a cigarette before but now doing vaping instead, the question still remains, if there wasn't a vaping product out there, would they have instead tried cigarettes? They would have been addicted to nicotine all the same. But now they're using what is potentially a more hazardous product, you know, cigarettes versus vaping. By the way, I should come back and explain precisely what vaping is for anyone who's watching that might not understand this exactly. Vaping is, compared with smoking a cigarette, where you're lighting tobacco on fire and you're inhaling hundreds of chemicals. Vaping is where there's a distillate of nicotine and there's this flavor, and then there's some other medium that some kind of liquid that they have these little machines like we saw in this news story. Here you see one of these things, and instead of combusting tobacco, it is vaporizing this chemical. So the lung is inhaling a vapor of a chemically more simple compound than cigarettes. Now, that does not mean they're completely safe, but there needs to be some research into this. Vaping is a pretty new product. Research has only really just begun into the comparative effects on lungs in the long term versus smoking. And of course, because there aren't people who have been vaping for a period of years, it's just still early to say that vaping is going to be as harmful or worse than cigarettes. And of course, just because of the nature of vapors versus smoke and a simple chemical versus the tobacco plant, as I know a lot of news stories have talked about and research has talked about, there's hundreds of chemicals in tobacco smoke. Some of that's from the plant, and some of that's even added by the tobacco companies. So the question of whether or not vaping is safer than cigarettes, not that it's safe, but perhaps safer, is absolutely critical here. And likewise, the question for youth using vaping products, the question is critical. Are they doing that in place of smoking cigarettes instead? So anyway, so the governor made this argument. She says we need to ban vaping, and here's the order that came out just a few days later. And it says, well, actually, you know what? Let's go to, there was a hearing in the legislature that happened in the period in between when these rules were issued and previously when they were announced. So the governor announced there was going to be this emergency rule, and then there was a hearing in the legislature, and then this rule was actually issued. So we've got a video of the governor's chief medical officer, Dr. Joni Caldoun, talking about why this rule is needed and why it's lawful. And let me go back and explain first what an emergency rule is, because that's an important thing. As I had mentioned earlier, you have typically a rulemaking process that involves a notice of proposed rulemaking. There's draft rules that are issued. There are public hearings. There's revisions. In Michigan, a final rule gets sent to the legislature, which can delay it, and they can actually, by legislation, overturn it. Although that's not an easy process, but the point being there's this extended period for public input. But according to Michigan law, when you're talking about emergency rules, they're allowed to skip over all of that. So here is the legal basis for the governor making an emergency rule. It says, if an agency finds that preservation of the public health, safety, and welfare requires promulgation of an emergency rule without following the notice and participation procedures required for what is essentially for an ordinary rule, and they state in the rule the agency's reasons for that finding, and the governor concurs, the agency may dispense with all or part of the procedures and file. And by the way, all or part, if you may dispense with all or part of the procedures, you can dispense with all of them, and that's what they did. They had no public hearing, they had no comment, there was no draft period. They just put this out. So then they can file in the office, and there's some legalese here, but the rest that's important is to say that the rule may be in effect for up to 6 months and may be extended for an additional 6 months, not more than that, by a filing of the governor's certificate of the need, and then that's it. So the governor, through an emergency declaration, can pass an emergency rule for 6 months, and that can be extended up to an additional 6 months for a full year total. It's not clear, however, if after that 1 year period elapses, if she couldn't simply pass an additional emergency rule, maybe to avoid a judge saying, come on, this is just essentially the same as an extension, just maybe change it in a trivial manner and say, no, this is a brand new rule. That is yet to be determined. But in the meantime, that's what the law says. It says essentially, if the relevant head of the department says they need to do this, there's a finding of emergency, the governor agrees, then she has the authority. And by the way, here's the important issue here, or at least one of the issues here. The governor appoints the heads of all the departments. So, and Governor Whitmer has been in office less than 1 year. So if when she was assuming office, she had an idea that she might want to do this, she might have even asked the people being interviewed for the position, is this something that you would support? So, and of course, she can fire the department heads. So, although the law actually says the agency has to have a finding of the emergency and the governor concurs, the reality is they all report to the governor. It's basically the governor's decision to declare an emergency, and that is not limited by any requirement here in the statute for a definition of an emergency. Now, there is a potential that the courts can still find there is some reason that an emergency is not valid. We'll look into that in just a moment here. But now I'm going to go to this video, and we're going to go to the hearing where Dr. Caldoun, who is the chief medical officer at the Department of Health and Human Services, she was the official who found that the preservation of public health, safety, and welfare required this rule. So she's defending the rule that she essentially called for, although again, in essence, it really was the governor's decision. The Department of Health and Human Services is bigger than just the chief medical officer, but she's the relevant person to make the determination. So we're going to go to the video here. So let me just cue up the clip. Let's see, where's my mouse cursor? Here it is, and let's listen to the clip.
Honorable members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today regarding youth use of vapor products and alternative nicotine products, including e-cigarettes, which the Department of Health and Human Services has declared a public health emergency. The Michigan Department of Health and Human Services is empowered by the Public Health Code to exercise authority and promulgate rules.
So she's saying what I just said here. And remember, because she was the one that made the finding of an emergency, she's not just defending the public policy of banning vaping products. She's actually also making a legal argument here saying, we have the authority, we've declared the emergency. And notice how many times she keeps repeating the term emergency, because she's trying to lay out to the legislature, no, you don't have the power here. We have the power. We've declared this an emergency.
To safeguard the public's health, the department may also promulgate emergency rules without following the notice and participation procedures of Michigan compiled laws when such an emergency finding is made, according to the Administrative Procedures Act. Youth vaping is a public health emergency, and these measures were necessary and authorized to protect the public's health.
By the way, since smoking is also a youth epidemic, why has the government never banned cigarettes on the basis of that it's a youth epidemic? Probably because after the last couple hundred years of public policy debates, it was decided that would be an unwise move. We don't want to take cigarettes away from adults, even though we acknowledge it is indeed an epidemic among youth.
Since 2014, e-cigarettes have been the most commonly used tobacco product among youth in the U.S.
Well, okay, but if vaping is not as harmful to your health as smoking, then vaping being the most used tobacco product is better than cigarettes being the most used tobacco products. It really is coming down to this question here of what is more harmful to one's health, smoking or vaping.
Nationwide, e-cigarette use among middle and high school students increased by 900% between 2011 and 2015.
900%. Now that sounds like an enormously high number. Of course, it's a ninefold increase, so we're not 900 times more, it's a ninefold increase. And as far as I know, and I don't know exactly when vaping products first hit the market, but she says this is between 2011 and 2015. I would imagine 2011 is about when these things first became available. So it's a misleading comparison to say that there's been a ninefold increase in usage of a product that only even just recently came into existence and is starting from having no usage whatsoever. And of course, again, there's no comparison here between smoking and vaping, and that's the key distinction.
The total number of children who are currently using e-cigarettes rose to an astonishing 3.6 million youth in 2018.
How many smoked?
1.5 million more than the previous year. Between 2015 and 2018, every county in the state of Michigan who reported on youth e-cigarette use saw an increase. And some of those counties actually saw more than a doubling of the number of youth who use e-cigarettes.
How many smoked?
According to a recent study, 81% of youth e-cigarette users reported using a flavored e-cigarette as their first use. This epidemic can be attributed in large part to the appeal of the flavored vaping products, bubblegum, as well as advertising and promotional activities by companies that glamorize use of nicotine products.
Citation needed. Now, I don't watch television. I don't know how many ads for vaping products are out there. I can't recall seeing one vaping product advertised with a bubblegum flavor anywhere.
Nationwide. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, has concluded that the use of e-cigarettes is unsafe for kids,
So are cigarettes.
teens, and young adults, and that young people who use e-cigarettes may be more likely to smoke cigarettes in the future.
So are people that are already smoking cigarettes. Yes, nicotine is addictive, and if you're already vaping, yes, you could transition to smoking. And as we'll see from witness coming up here, the reason why vaping is popular is because it's preferential for a lot of users to cigarettes. So to say that, yes, this is like there was an old argument, well, marijuana is a gateway drug to heroin or to all these other harder drugs. And that was a major justification for criminalizing marijuana. But the evidence just wasn't there to support that.
Let's be clear. The nicotine in e-cigarettes is harmful to young people's developing brains, and we all know that nicotine has long-term health consequences, including heart disease and cancer.
No, I don't know that. I know that smoking causes heart disease and other health problems. I know that nicotine is addictive, and nicotine is in cigarettes. That doesn't mean that the nicotine in and of itself causes heart disease, causes brain damage, or whatever she means by saying it harms their developing brains. I don't know that. I know that nicotine is the addictive substance in cigarettes, but as I understand it, it's smoking that causes the health problems.
In December of 2018, the United States Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams, officially declared e-cigarette use among youth in the United States an epidemic. Dr. Adams issued an advisory on e-cigarette use among youth noting that action must be promptly taken to protect the health of young people. Based upon data and the emerging public health threat associated with youth use of e-cigarettes and alternative nicotine products, the Department of Health and Human Services concludes that youth use of e-cigarettes and alternative nicotine products in Michigan constitutes an emergency, and that promulgation of emergency rules to preserve the public's health, safety, and welfare is required. It is also very important to note that this public health emergency is occurring in the context of there being over 450 possible hospitalizations and cases of severe lung illness associated with vaping across the country.
Vaping. Vaping what, though? This is another issue, and this is going to be a very important issue. It's not just nicotine that people are vaping. It's also marijuana. It's also other drugs. And those aren't necessarily regulated the way that vaping products are. But we'll get to that in just a moment.
Including 6 people who have died. Gratefully, we have
Okay, well, let's let her finish the sentence.
not experienced any of those deaths here in the state of Michigan.
Okay, so 6 people have died nationally, 0 in Michigan as a result of vaping. Now think about all the public policy surrounding other drugs, legal and illegal drugs. There's all kinds of questions about whether all kinds of medical treatments have dangerous side effects and can cause death. And some have caused many. We actually still in hospitals use opioids for a number of things, even though those have been shown to be extremely addictive and absolutely terrible for people that get addicted to them. But we still use them when people need emergency pain relief, in hospice care, and what have you. So this is why you have a public policy debate process. Her testimony is almost over. I mean, it's literally probably not more than a minute left. And this is a very, very brief argument. I mean, it is very shy on facts. She just quotes a Surgeon General and a few other things here. This is far from the kind of rigorous research in a presentation that we should expect would be necessary in order to justify completely banning a consumer product that 400,000 Michiganders use, and that indeed many people actually make their living manufacturing, selling, and everything else.
But we have 6 confirmed or probable cases here in the state, and we're currently investigating several more. Since the emergency declaration of the department, the CDC has actually urged everyone to strongly consider not using vaping products at all.
Sure, your doctor will also urge you to not smoke and to not drink alcohol. That does not necessarily mean it should be banned for everybody all the time.
When Governor Whitmer announced the emergency finding by the Department of Health and Human Services and the fact that emergency rules would be forthcoming, leading healthcare organizations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Michigan chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, the American
These are just
Lung
endorsements.
Association, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, and Truth Initiative issued a joint statement in support of these actions. And they specifically called these actions necessary and appropriate, and called for the FDA to immediately remove all flavored e-cigarettes from the market across the country.
Just because an organization endorses something doesn't amount to the research that you should need to present to policymakers to justify banning its existence.
In addition, on September 10th of 2019, Bloomberg Philanthropies announced the creation of a new $160 million initiative to end the youth e-cigarette epidemic. And just yesterday.
Yeah, and they've spent billions of dollars trying to stop the youth smoking epidemic to virtually no effect. So it really is the essential question. Is vaping less harmful than smoking? And is vaping displacing smoking? That is a critical question that she does not address. And you'll notice she also has not in any way addressed the question of whether the health impacts of vaping are associated with vaping flavored nicotine products versus unflavored nicotine products versus marijuana and other drugs that people also vape.
President Trump announced that they too are moving forward to ban flavored e-cigarettes.
Not anymore.
The data regarding the epidemic of youth vaping is very clear, and it constitutes a public health emergency.
She
The
said emergency
statements and
11
actions
times so
on
far.
behalf of health care organizations dedicated to protecting the public's health further support our finding and the steps we are taking to address it. I am very proud that the state of Michigan is leading the effort nationwide to protect young people. Thank you.
And that's the testimony. There are some questions, and actually there are going to be several other witnesses that we don't have time to show here, but I will put a link in the description because the debate is actually really quite interesting. There's going to be a witness coming up talking about things that I haven't even mentioned yet, such as what happens when you criminalize a product that millions of Americans, I think 11 million Americans, use. And the answer is you create a black market with all kinds of terrible consequences. We saw that with prohibition. It's the reason why cigarettes today are still legal. And even now why they're decriminalizing marijuana in a growing number of states, because there's a huge criminal problem associated with criminalizing a product that people use. So that's not addressed whatsoever. But some other witnesses do bring that up. And of course, you'll have people coming up talking about the value of using vaping in place of smoking, and that the research just is not yet there to demonstrate that vaping is something that's piling on top of the existing epidemic of smoking versus how much it's replacing what previously was people smoking. And that's a critical distinction. But I do want to play a clip from one of the witnesses whose testimony is just extremely powerful. So let me see if I can cue up the clip here. One moment. We're going to go to an hour and 23 minutes. Let's see if I get it.
All right. And why don't you come up, explain who you are, and why you're here today, and maybe how long you drove to get here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. My name is Mark Sliss. I'm from Houghton, Michigan. I drove 501 miles to get here. I believe I own the furthest vape shop from the Capitol. I'm also not a public speaker. I'm very nervous, so I will apologize in advance. I'm just going to read a small prepared statement here. I reside in Hancock, Michigan. I'm a lifelong resident of this state.
This is about 200 miles from the nearest major city.
A dentist, a nurse, and soon-to-be doctor. I'm a college graduate, a scientist. I own 2 businesses in the state. An international geophysical consulting firm that I started in 2009, and a vape shop I purchased in 2015. I smoked for 41 years. You can probably hear it in my voice. I spent 30 of those years trying to quit with every available method I could find, not just in this country, but in other countries because I worked abroad, including hypnosis. I tried all of these things multiple times, nonstop, for 30 years and failed every single time. I don't think I ever quit for even one day over 30 years. Not my wife, my children pleading with me to quit worked. My doctors, I've always had a team of doctors. I work in a dangerous environment, and they watch your health very carefully. Them telling me that I would die did not help. Nothing helped. In March of 2014, I noticed a new business in Houghton, downtown Houghton, and I just popped my head in to see what it was. And there was a 19-year-old young man behind the counter, and he told me that they sold electronic cigarettes, and he invited me in. 20 minutes later, I walked out a non-smoker. That was 100% due to the flavors. I've tried everything. Nothing worked. It was the flavors. In fact, I even tried an unflavored nicotine manual cigarette, which was just a nicotine-soaked sponge that you drew on. It did not work. So a 19-year-old kid with a high school education did what nobody else could do, what government couldn't do, what public health couldn't do, what the medical community couldn't do in 30 years, get me to quit smoking. It didn't cost the state or the federal government a dime. It was a simple explanation, and it worked, and a simple product. from where you sit that it didn't cost the state anything.
We like that.
You should know that. Year and a half later, I bought that shop that saved my life. In the next 4 years, I've saved about 1,000 lives. I've saved 1,000 people from smoking. They've permanently quit, and that's who I'm here to represent. And those people I haven't yet reached. Those 1,000 people, they're all from Houghton County. It has a population of roughly 36,000 people according to the U.S. Census. So the people that I've helped to quit and helped to save their own lives, that's 2.7% of the total population of my county. Not just adults, that's 2.7%. I don't know what percentage of adults. I didn't look that far. I can't imagine anybody not seeing that as not only significant, but extraordinary. I defy anybody in my county to say that they've helped to save that many lives, including the doctors. That's a lot of people in 4 years. My current customers include nurses, doctors, officers from every single local police department, the state police post, even a chief of police. Excuse me. Multiple business owners, firemen, first responders, teachers, elected officials, most importantly, dozens of veterans. And these people are all grandmothers, grandfathers, yes, that old, fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. They're my friends and my neighbors. There's nowhere I can go in Houghton County and not run into a customer or a former customer who is still not smoking. It happens every day. I'm extremely proud of this, extremely. Helping these people to save their own lives has been the most rewarding experience of my life, by far. Outside of raising my 3 children, of course, especially if they're listening. And now our governor seeks to make that a crime punishable by 6 months in prison. These orders also make it a crime for my customers to have more than 4 bottles of a flavored liquid, punishable by 6 months in prison. All of my customers, every one of them walk around with 3 or 4 bottles of different flavors.
That's another issue I didn't bring up.
To the flavors themselves.
I think in the final order, that bit actually got taken out. The part about saying that you can possess more than 4 bottles of flavors. I don't think I saw that in the final rule. So I think that little part got removed, which is something. But he's making an extremely powerful argument here that these are things that people use to quit smoking, and depriving them of what they have used to stop smoking is an immense harm to the public health, and can, even if vaping is as bad or worse than smoking cigarettes, well, I guess not in that case. But he's saying we're getting off of smoking from vaping, and that it all comes back to this fundamental question: is vaping as bad or worse than cigarettes, or is it safer? Not safe, but safer, and that's a crucial distinction.
Because that's why we're here. All my customers have 3 things in common. They are adults, they are desperate to quit smoking after years, if not decades, of failing, and they all use flavors. The numbers in my shop are that 99% of my customers use flavors.
So he's destroying the myth they were saying earlier about the flavors being just part of a marketing campaign towards children. The idea that adults only smoke adult flavors, such as cigarette. You know, why would any adult want to buy a vaping product flavored like a cigarette when they can buy one flavored like an apple? Cigarettes are rancid and disgusting. You'd want to buy any other flavor than a cigarette flavored vaping product. So he's making the point. If you take away the flavors, you're essentially taking away vaping, period. And that is critical because that undermines the whole marketing element of, oh no, vaping, the flavors are just for the kids, and that's just what they want to do to get children hooked. He says, no, adults, all of the adults, virtually all the adults are using flavors because flavors are preferable to unflavored or tobacco-flavored vaping products.
The flavors are absolutely necessary, and they are the key to quitting smoking, the single largest killer of humans in this state, in this country, and on this planet. I don't know why that's not being taken into greater consideration with these orders.
Because it goes against the narrative.
We carry 80 flavors at my shop. All of them are chosen by my customers, not me. All of my customers are adults. One example, the favorite flavor of my oldest customer, or at least the one I was brave enough to ask, she was an 87-year-old grandmother. Her favorite flavor, the flavor that she quit smoking with, is Fruity Pebbles cereal. She's 87 years old. That was her choice. I've heard people up there say that adults don't do these flavors. That's not true. I have 80 flavors chosen by adults. Not one of them chose tobacco flavored, the only one that will be left. So the result of this is, for me, if the governor's order stands and flavors are banned, I will immediately go out of business and file for bankruptcy. No question. I've already talked to my accountant and my lawyer, and they agree. It's over. I think my experience will be mirrored across this state, and you'll see every vape shop close up, and owners file for bankruptcy, and employees be fired, lose their jobs.
Well, but not gas stations that sell vaping products, because they've got convenience stores and gasoline. They've got other products income to fall back on. I wonder if they had any input on this.
You won't just be banning flavors. You'll be banning a life-saving industry from this state, guaranteed. The result of that will be that everybody who's currently trying to quit will be forced back to smoking and trying to quit again. The other available methods have a 93% failure rate. That's what you will doom these people to. That's unforgivable. That is absolutely unforgivable. My customers, in comparison, they enjoy an 80 to 90% success rate, the exact opposite. I know I'm saving lives. I'm getting these people to quit at those kind of numbers, and you will doom them to a 93% failure rate. And a good chance, I think the statistic is half the people that smoke die from smoking in this country. That is 480,000 people a year, 3,100 a day. That's huge. Those people are not being considered with this order at all. I'd like to delve into the science. I'm a scientist first, but I know I don't have the time. The only other thing I'd like to say is, and I don't know if it was brought up by the gentleman previously from England, but the difference in public health between here and there is the government not only encourages it, the Royal College of Physicians, Public Health England, they are now currently opening up vape shops in their hospitals.
Wow.
I think the people in this country, the decision makers, the regulators, they're being deceived. The science is out there. This has been studied for a long time. They're not making a mistake in England putting vape shops in hospitals. They know it works. They know it saves lives. As already been stated, harm reduction it works.
I don't know that they're being deceived. Maybe they're the deceivers.
And that's being ignored with this order.
Representative Lefebvre has a question.
Okay, I'm going to pause the clip there. And before I do anything else, because this is where I botched up when I made the recording last time, let me go back to the web browser here, so I don't completely botch up the video a second time here. So he's made a lot of good points here, and again, it really comes down to the question of whether or not vaping is less harmful than cigarettes. Well, there's other questions too. There's a question of whether or not the government should be outright banning products in the first place. There is that. But from the utilitarian perspective of what's in the best interest of public health, that's the question: is vaping harmful than cigarette? Is it more harmful than cigarettes, or is it less harmful? And the research is just not out there. This gentleman's passionate arguments fell on deaf ears. As you saw, the governor put out the executive order, or the emergency rule on September 18th. Let's briefly look at the science once more before we get into where things are legally now with the emergency rule and the ban on vaping in Michigan. Here's a story in the New York Times. Well, first of all, here's this more recent story where doctors in Detroit performed a double lung transplant on a teenager who allegedly had his lungs ravaged from vaping. And they actually have, this story made the New York Times, there's the video of a doctor showing how this lung was completely incapacitated from vaping, and so therefore you've got over here the transplanted lung. Here's the thing that is interesting about this. You've got 11 million people in the United States that vape nicotine regularly. And then we have these isolated cases of someone's lungs just being absolutely destroyed. And, typically when you have something that causes something else, there is kind of a bell curve of people that are outliers in being affected and people that are outliers in being not affected, and the bulk of people fall kind of near the average. So it's very unusual that you'd find a young, healthy person whose lungs are absolutely ravaged by vaping in such a short time. It makes you wonder if there's some kind of other possible explanation for what's going on here. Like maybe it's not nicotine that they've been vaping. And remember, your doctor is not an attorney. Your doctor is not a forensic analyst. He's there to make you healthy. So the doctor says, what caused this? You say, he's been vaping. Okay. Did they ask vaping what? And if he was vaping something other than nicotine, would he tell his doctor that? That's an important question because, marijuana, although it's been decriminalized in Michigan, there's certain things people don't want to admit to their doctors. So you've got this long story in the New York Times about this double lung transplant. And of course, the narrative is vaping is terrible, vaping is dangerous, vaping is deadly. All this goes toward the narrative. But buried way, 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 way down here is this statement that is just left here in the middle of a paragraph, isn't followed up in any way in the story. About 86% of the patients with lung injuries in this outbreak had vaped THC, the chemical in marijuana that makes people high. Well, maybe it's got something to do with that. But then again, people smoke marijuana too. So why would vaping be less harmful than smoking for cigarettes, but more harmful than smoking for marijuana? Well, here's the interesting story. Because when you're vaping marijuana, you're not just vaping that leaf either. Remember, someone's got to make this chemical that goes into this machine and gets vaporized. So one hypothesis under investigation, according to this story, is that there's this chemical, vitamin E acetate, which could be dangerous when aerosolized and inhaled. Oh, that's a clue. There's this potentially dangerous chemical that's in marijuana vaping, but not in nicotine vaping. At the very least, we should be saying more research is needed. Let's not get crazy and start banning products and creating black markets and putting people out of business and getting people back into smoking for something that we don't fully understand yet. But that's what the governor did. So what happens next? The vaping ban went into effect. Vaping flavored products, which was pretty much all of them, went off of the shelves. And that gentleman we just saw sued the state. I think he sued him in his local court. It got put over to the Court of Claims, which is a special court we have in Michigan that handles cases where you're suing the state government. And the Court of Claims actually not only Well, they didn't. Well, let's see what they said. I don't want to say they ruled in his favor, but what they did was they issued an injunction putting a stop to the ban. That does not mean that the case is over. It means the court was willing to issue an injunction to halt the ban on the basis of a number of factors. One of them has to be that the judge believes that the plaintiff, the owner of the vape shop, will prevail. So let's see what she says here. She says, there's actually multiple plaintiffs. Not only is plaintiff a clean cigarette, lost a significant percentage of its sales and closed several stores due to the ban will force plaintiff to rebrand itself entirely. In essence, the emergency rules will destroy plaintiff a clean cigarettes business as it currently exists. And you've got the quote from Mark Sliss. He says, we're not usually open on Tuesdays, but once he or I or both of us are there, we're already going to open the doors and turn on the open sign. My customers already started going to Wisconsin for the vapes, or my newer customers already went back to cigarette smoking, which hurts even worse. My motivation wasn't so much for my business, but to help the people break the cigarette habit. That's the big win. And then going on to, we're going to come back to what the governor's objection was, but quoting from the judge again, to understand her legal reasoning for the injunction, she says here, there is evidence in the record supporting the notion that many adult users of flavored vaping products will return to more harmful combustible tobacco products. And she also says, indeed, an agency cannot create an emergency by way of its own failure to act. The court concludes that the record, at least at this juncture, does not substantiate the declaration of an emergency, which necessitated dispensing with the normal rulemaking procedures which afford the public meaningful opportunities to be heard. Now, there may be some judicial precedent or maybe something elsewhere in the statute that says that you can't just declare an emergency, although when we looked at the statute on emergency rulemaking, it didn't define an emergency. It didn't flesh out any requirements there. But somehow, this judge believes that, yes, they have a strong case here. I'm going to take this headphone out. They have a good case here. And I don't want these people's business to be destroyed while this is still making its way through the courts. So the judge issued an injunction. Now, the governor says in this article, and we'll look at the filing in a moment, but the Attorney General says, we are resolute in our efforts on behalf of Governor Whitmer and the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services to protect the health of Michigan's children. This is an urgent public matter that demands immediate attention. The governor says the decision is wrong. It misreads the law and sets a dangerous precedent of a court second-guessing the expert judgment of public health officials dealing with a crisis. That's a stretch right there. This was the judgment of political appointees. And then she says the explosive increase in youth vaping is a public health emergency. Again, she keeps reiterating emergency, emergency, emergency to legitimize that she believes that she has the right to declare this to be an emergency. We must do everything we can to protect our kids from its harmful effects. So the governor filed suit. They went right around the Court of Appeals, straight to the Michigan Supreme Court. And the interesting thing about this filing is that it's not a filing appealing the Court of Claims decision to overturn the ban, because the Court of Claims hasn't yet made that decision. What they're doing is attacking the injunction. So under the question here, I'm not going to read this entire motion, but it says the statement of question presented to the Supreme Court is, and there's a lot of very editorial language here, Michigan Department of Health and Human Services has the statutory authority to promulgate emergency rules, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Despite the lack of any, quote, serious dispute that a vaping use crisis exists among youth, citation needed. That was what the Court of Claims actually did say. They say they even pointed out, compared to smoking, we don't know that this is actually a increase in harm. So the Court of Claims relying heavily on Michigan State AFL-CIO v. Secretary of State, preliminarily enjoined enforcement of emergency rules issued to combat that crisis based on the court's own belief that DHHS waited too long to issue them. So AFL-CIO v. Secretary of State had nothing to do with public health, nothing to do with smoking or drugs or anything like that. It was a case of actually related to voting. And the Court of Claims in that case had issued this injunction for not the same reason, but similarly saying that we think that this is a strong case and you can't do this because it's going to change policy radically, and this has to be moved through the courts first. So they put out an injunction, and the Supreme Court upheld. So they're arguing against the injunction. So if the Supreme Court comes back and overturns the Court of Claims, it does not rule one way or the other on the emergency rule itself. It's against the injunction, and that would put the rules back into effect for, I guess, the remaining of the 6 months. So that's what they're saying. Should the court bypass the application, reverse the court of claims, and vacate its preliminary injunction? And of course, there's more editorialization here, and of course, throughout this entire document, which I don't know. I mean, I don't think if I was writing a legal document, I'd want to be insulting the courts by talking about the magnitude of the court's errors and all the rest. But that's what she said, and that's where it is. So right now, the injunction is in effect. Most stores that I've seen, I haven't noticed the flavors back on the shelves yet, because once they put out the injunction, distributors expected they weren't going to have anything to sell in Michigan, so it takes a long time for things to make their way back in again. So, and again, we don't know how fast the Supreme Court will act. This was put out just a month ago. Typically, courts are very, very slow. So the governor and the attorney general are leaning very hard on the Supreme Court here. You got to take this case up now. I think there was a quote somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. But let's see. We've already looked at these. But somewhere I think I saw either the governor or the attorney general saying this is an issue that we need to get addressed right away before this keeps happening. Maybe it was in the filing. I think it might have been. Let's see. Well, I'm not going to go through this, but you guys get the idea. This is right now an issue before the Michigan Supreme Court, not on vaping itself, but on the ability of the Court of Claims to issue an injunction suspending a temporary, an emergency rule. One way or the other, the rule would expire at the end of 6 months. Too bad for all the businesses that go under and all the employees that get laid off, because people can hopefully eventually get back to vaping again, unless there's some kind of federal action or unless the legislature passes a law. But as we looked at earlier, there's a reason why the legislative process is difficult. There's a reason why, and it's done that way intentionally. They want to make it so that it's easier to stop a law from being passed than to pass a law. So, you'll have to persuade a majority in both chambers, in committees. Committee chairman can kill a bill just by not bringing it up for a hearing. So you'll have to persuade lawmakers that they would all want to alienate a substantial number of voters in their own party and in the middle. And of course, they don't care much about the voters in the opposing party, but they'll be upset too. They might give money to an opposing politician that says they support freedom. Or what have you. So right now in Michigan, the ban is suspended. It could be reversed and go back into effect for another 5 months. I think, is it 5 months? Something like that. Could be extended by another 6 if the Supreme Court overturns the injunction, or if the Court of Claims actually hears the case and rules and decides to leave the rule in effect. That would overturn the injunction automatically. So that's what happened in Michigan. I don't know how it goes in other states. At the federal level, it sounds like the administration has backed off for now. Even if they don't, there still would typically be an extended rulemaking process. It wouldn't be done by emergency, because I think the president has sharper political instincts than to alienate a lot of voters than by putting out an emergency rule, because those 400,000 Michigan people that vape probably are none too happy with the governor right now. And whatever their political affiliation is, they're probably going to remember this come the next election, which fortunately for the governor is going to be for another 3 years. So that's where things are. Hope this video was interesting and informative. If you have any questions, leave them in the chat, or in the comments rather. I'll put the link to the testimony from the hearings in the description. If you enjoy this content, we're a brand new channel, so please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you all for watching. Hope this was informative, and have a